After spending the first 16 years of my life in the city, moving out to the country was a breath of fresh air, literally. I was lucky enough to learn to drive out on the open roads rather than the congested streets of New York City. I typically did most of my driving during the day, but whenever I had to drive at night, I was always very careful. You never know when a deer or something might jump out at you. Now, on the rare occasion that I was driving at night, I found the later it was, the more peaceful the road was. Well, that wasn't the case when I was driving home from a concert about 6 years ago. It was around midnight by the time that I managed to get out of the parking lot and onto the road, and I had a 3-hour drive ahead of me, so I made sure to get out of there as quickly as possible. And for the most part, the drive was going as expected. There was hardly anyone else on the road as it got further away from the concert venue, and the sky was clear with a bright moon to light the road ahead of me. However, things turned way less blissful as I passed through a small intersection where I noticed another car pull onto the road behind me. This didn't bother me at all because I figured there was plenty of room for everyone. This driver obviously didn't feel the same way though. As they pulled up closer behind me, their headlights began to blind me through my rearview mirror. And since we are on a single lane road and not a highway or double lane, there was nowhere for the car to pass me. I began slowing down a bit as I could feel my anxieties start to rise, and I was considering pulling over to let the car pass me, but that's when the driver in the car behind me began to honk their horn. As I grew more uncomfortable, I continued to slow down, only now I had my hazards on, hoping that the driver would take the hint and begin passing me, but they didn't. Instead, they continued to speed up their car until eventually I felt it tap up against my trunk. My car started losing control as the driver behind me continued to knock into the back of my car, and the only thing that I could think to do was to speed up. I pushed down on the gas and began making a small gap between myself and the car behind me, but the driver of the car quickly began speeding up as well and closed the gap that I had just made. They began slamming down on their horn again, and I heard the sound of their car revving as it continued to speed forward and hit the rear of my car. I did everything I could to keep the car on the road, but that became increasingly difficult each time they ran into my trunk. Eventually, I saw a small pull-off and managed to rip my steering wheel to the right and pulled my car off the road and out of the way of the car behind me. As soon as the car was parked, I began calling 911, which was when I noticed the car that had been chasing me ended up stopping in the pull-off as well. I began giving the man on the phone my location as the other driver got out of their car and approached mine. As they got closer, I could see that it was a man driving the other car who looked to be about 5 or 10 years older than me. I could hear him screaming as he approached my car and began pounding his hand on the hood. He was yelling about how slow I was going on the road, and at one point he even tried to open my door by pulling up the handle. Thankfully, the police were able to get there before the man drove off. And after inspecting the damage on both of the cars, they ended up arresting the man for reckless driving, among other charges. At the end of the day, though, it was all chalked up to a bad case of road rage. When you go off to college, a lot of people warn you about the dangers that can occur on campus, but what no one warns you about is the ride home. While I'm sure most people have fun and possibly even memorable rides home from school with their family, mine was only memorable because I made it home with my life. It was the beginning of December and the fall semester had just ended, and at the time, I had made plans with some friends back at home to go see the midnight release of a movie that was coming out instead of taking my exams and then driving home the next day. I planned to drive home as soon as I finished my schoolwork. This meant that I left campus around 4 in the afternoon. I would make it to the mall for the movie just in time, so I did just that. I left right after my last test, and I could not have been more excited to see my friends. I had about a 6.5-hour drive ahead of me, so I got comfortable and began making my way home as quickly but safely as possible. Now that being said, even though I was in a rush, I was still raised to be helpful. I was always taught growing up that if you saw someone on the side of the road, you stop and ask if they need help. Sometimes people don't need anything and you just keep driving, but you never know when someone might need you. So at around 9:30 at night, as I was driving along this dimly lit back road, when I saw a car parked on the side of the road, I didn't even hesitate. I pulled over and hopped out of my car to ask if they needed any help. Right away, I could see the car was being driven by an elderly man, and he claimed that his car had a flat tire on the passenger side and asked me if I would help him put the spare on for him. I told him of course and asked him to pop the trunk so I could get the tire out, and he did. But as I leaned into the trunk to lift up the mat that covers the spare, I felt the man press something against my neck. My entire body tensed up as I could feel the shocks from the taser that he just pressed against me fired. I keeled over forward and the man was able to easily push me and force me into the trunk of his car before slamming it shut. I recovered from being tased before we pulled off from the side of the road. But as I reached above me for the emergency handle that it's in most trunks, I couldn't find it. I could feel the tires moving as we began making our way down the secluded back street when I realized the old man had forgotten to take my phone before locking me up. He must have been in such a hurry and didn't want to risk being overpowered that it didn't even cross his mind. I squirmed around in the trunk until I could get my hand into my pocket and pull my phone out. After calling the police and telling them what road I was just on, it was only a matter of a couple of minutes before they were able to find me. I heard the sound of police sirens behind us as they pulled the elderly man over, and once the car came to a stop, I began banging on the trunk to let the officers know where I was. Once the man was in custody and I was out of the trunk, I asked the officer if he knew why the man tried to abduct me, but he didn't know why. It wasn't until the trial that we learned that this man, who I thought was old and frail, had actually confessed to abducting multiple people between the 90s and the late 2000s. I was just the lucky one. About 4 years ago, while I was driving home from work, I saw something that at first seemed like it was straight out of a horror movie. It was during my time as a bartender in New Paltz, New York, and for the most part, I loved my job. I was never much of a drinker, but I loved all my customers and the friends that I made over the years. Plus, I used to suffer from some pretty nasty insomnia, so working overnights was perfect for me. The bar typically closed around 3 a.m., and after cleanup and whatnot, I would usually be on my way home between 4 and 5 in the morning, just before sunrise. That night though, we ended up closing early because it was a slow night, and by the time 1:30 rolled around, the bar was completely empty. So we closed up and I got to head home a little bit early, which is most likely what ended up saving someone's life. After locking up the bar that night, I climbed into my car and got ready to drive home. I plugged my phone into the auxiliary cord, started playing some music, and before long it was just me and an empty road. I took the route that I usually drove to get home, which, on a good night, was only about a 25-minute drive. Even though it was dark, it was a very scenic route. I often spent a lot of my time when I was stopped at intersections gazing off into the woods that lined the streets. Now, along Route 52, the road that I would take home, there was this one intersection that had an old church sitting off to the side of the road. And I remember as I passed it that night that there was a car in the otherwise empty parking lot, which I thought was odd. No one was ever at that church in the middle of the night, but I assumed that it was just some high school kids hanging out and kept on driving. Route 52 may have been considered a main road, but because of the area where we were in, there still weren't many streetlights along the side of it. So in the dark of the night, you have to be wary around the turns. Something that I learned after growing up in that area. You never know what's going to jump out at you. It could be a deer, a bear, or even a person, which is what happened to me. It was only about 2 minutes after I passed by the church as I made my way around one of the bends in the road I practically stood on the brakes. My car came to a screeching halt. I tried not to freak out as my mind processed what was in front of me. Off to the side of the road, I could see a man who didn't seem to notice my headlight shining on him. He was walking in the same direction that I was driving in, but there was something wrong with him. With each step he took, I could see that he had a deep limp and was almost dragging his right leg instead of lifting it. As I looked closer, it did not take me long to notice that his shirt and pants were covered in what looked like dirt and blood. It was at that point that I figured the man must have been injured if he was walking like a zombie and covered in blood. So I decided to try to get his attention, and I contacted the police and an ambulance. I pulled my phone out and began dialing 911. At the same time that I started rolling my window down, I called out for the man to stop and told him that I was getting him some help. But before I could start talking to the 911 operator on my phone, the man turned to face my car and immediately began yelling indescribably. I couldn't make out a single word that he was saying, but I knew that I needed to keep my distance when he reached into his pocket and pulled out a small pocket knife. The man could barely lift it to point it toward my car, but the second I saw the blade, I began backing up. At that point, the 911 operator was finally on the line with me, and I explained my situation and she told me to hang tight while I waited for an ambulance. I made sure to keep my distance from the man as he kept slowly hobbling toward my car with the knife in his hand, still yelling, though I couldn't understand him. After a couple of minutes went by, a police officer showed up and was able to disarm the man without anyone getting hurt. And upon further inspection, it was clear that the man wasn't thinking clearly. Once the ambulance arrived, it was determined that the man was likely the victim of a hit and run and was just deliriously wandering around. The ambulance rushed him to the nearest hospital, where I was told that he made a full recovery. I also reported the car that I had seen sitting at the church down the road from where I found the victim. It wasn't there when the police went to go look for it, but I think that might have been the one that hit the man.